Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the NOA webinar series. This is, I think, our 18th. I'm not sure about that, but today we're talking about a new service that has been initiated through the NHS to look at implant analysis after revision surgery. And we've got Jason Wilson from the implant analysis service to talk to us about that. And also we're very lucky, and I'm grateful for John Skinner joining us, who's now president of the BOA, but has a long history through Stanmore of implant analysis. And I've asked him to join us just to ask a few questions, see where this service is going to go. And then we'll have some questions, and we'll have a couple of polls as well to see what, just to gauge the interest in the new service. There will be references at the end as well and ways to contact us if people want any more information. So what's my background? I was Steve Copeland's first shoulder fellow, famous Reading shoulder surgeon, and he introduced the Copeland surface replacement. And there was an interesting surface replacement that I was very enthusiastic about. And when I took up my own practice in '95, I put lots in. But we certainly did have failure rates, and it seemed logical to me to analyze it because it was quite easy to take surface replacement off and put in a stemmed prosthesis. So I linked up with Stanmore at the time, Gordon Blun, who's since left Stanmore, I believe, and we looked at a series of surface replacement implants. And one of the criticisms was that during hip surgery, a surface replaces implants. Many of them failed because they got avascular necrosis underneath the head and they didn't get integration. So was that the same story with the Copeland surface replacement? And that's the main question we looked at. And what we did was we found out that actually there was very, very good integration with hydroxyapatite. And that's the reason why it was actually a very successful implant. And there was no evidence of avascular necrosis underneath the head. So it was encouraging, and the Copeland implant persisted for many years, has now been replaced really by the stemless implants. But after that experience, I just felt that maybe we should be looking at more implants. I've always felt this way. So I was quite pleased to hear that there was such thing as an NHS implant analysis, because it was a little bit tricky going to Stanmore. You needed, first of all, you needed to have a research project that sounded good, and you needed funding. But I always felt that there was some room for another implant service that would be linked more closely to clinical cases and the NHS. I've had a discussion with Keith Tucker, who's very keen on this new service, and I might just quote him later on in the discussions. But I think one of the things we looked at was, well, you know, why did it all go wrong? But having said that, this picture here of this Copeland implant, this has been in for 20 years in a young man who I put in it when he was only 30 for an unreconstructible fractured shoulder that presented late. And that's been in for 20 years. So we have to ask ourselves, well, how come this guy has done so well? Because this guy actually now at 20 years is coming up for revision. And it'd be very interesting to look at his implant as well. There's other things that sort of bother me as well. There's lots of new poly on the market that's harder, and that may influence the reaction around implants. So there's certainly, in my book, reasons to think where we should go with this and maybe expand it. So I was happy to hear that this service was now up and running. These are a couple of cases that I worried about. In the last 3 years, I've had a dislocated liner on a shoulder implant, and there's the poly there, and you'll see when the poly fails, you have metal on metal, and that's the ceramic head on the left, and you can see what damage that has done. So that's been investigated. I've also had a fractured pegs in a well-established all polyglenoid implant. This actually went to the MHRA. It's 3 years ago since it went in. It hasn't been dealt with as yet. The other case, implants have been sent to the manufacturers. and I haven't heard anything back since. So there is reason to believe that an independent NHS analysis might be a good thing here. Just to remind you, the webinar is being recorded. All participants are on mute. If you have any questions, there's a question tab that you can click on. If you have any any discussion in the background for the organizers, if you would use the chat function. Thank you. So our panel today, we're delighted to welcome Jason Wilson, who is a medical implant specialist. He'll explain himself, his background, and that title, I'm sure. And he's going to tell us what's happening with this relatively new NHS implant analysis service, which my understanding is started only last year in 2022. Just before that, we'll have a poll, then we'll have John Skinner, and then we'll have the panel discussion and questions and a further poll to close. Without any ado, Fallon, can you put up the poll, please? And then I'll stop sharing. So 2 questions. Number 1, I'm aware of the NHS implant service. Yes or no? Question 2, our hospitals do analyze implants retrieved from revision surgery. Yes, no, or don't know. So I'd be grateful if you would enter your answers now, and we'll have a short pause, and perhaps Fallon, you could post up the results of that, please. So 31% who were aware of the service, so 2/3 were not. So that's good and bad. So there's lots to learn today. Most people are not sure if we do implants. So only 20%, 1 in 5, are sure that we do analyze implants. So it's interesting to hear that. So lots to learn. So it should be a good hour. So Fallon, you can close that down, please. I'm going to stop sharing, Fallon. Actually, if I can stop sharing. So it's up to you, Fallon. If you can switch over to Jason's presentation, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much for that that introduction, Cormac. Yeah, you've kind of framed that really well. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you all today about this relatively new service. Albeit it's taken a long time to get it set up, but it's still in its infancy. Just to give a little bit of background, I'm now the strategic lead for medical devices and surgical, which sounds a very elaborate title, but essentially I've worked in this industry, being orthopedic medical devices, for about 30 years. So I have been very much kind of involved in the commercial side of things and trying to apply that into this NHS implant analysis service. I work part-time for the health service, so I still have some interests which are declared there, including Adler Ortho. I work with Greenbone, Corran on the Lars ligament, and a company called Physiolab. Next slide, please. So today I wanted to talk to you about this service, and we really started off with primary hips and primary knees, and then extended the service out, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the key thing here really was to focus on improved patient safety and to be able to offer an independent analysis of used medical devices. And again, I'll elaborate a little bit further, and Cormac's already alluded to it, it was very difficult to find a system of finding a way to have an implant analyzed if you had any concerns about it. This is a fully managed and supported service, and again, I'll run through some of the ways that we can support you to implement this into your hospitals. Next slide, please. Forgive me, these are still 2021 figures here, but you can see if we just look at primary hips and primary knees that have been implanted every year, the numbers are very high. You know, we're looking at 160,000 implants going in each year. And that's just looking at those primary hips, primary knees. If we then add in spine, shoulders, ankles, wrist, and all the other orthopedic types of products, they're very large numbers. And then if you extend that out even further into other medical devices, but I am going to focus on orthopedics today, you can see the potential for problems with products and the potential to learn from products is absolutely huge. Next slide, please. So just to give a little bit more background to that is there's been a huge increase in the sheer number of medical devices. And then also what we've seen over recent years is these adaptations and line extensions of existing brands, whereby a company may have a brand of product, but then they add in different sizes or different types of products alongside of those as well. So there's huge opportunity here for new products to enter the market where, relatively speaking, we may not have as much experience. Coupled with that, there's also new surgical procedures. Obviously, the big thing now is robotics, and we've seen navigation, and we've seen minimal invasive surgery also come to the forefront. But obviously, some of those products have not always performed as well as anticipated. And I'm sure you're familiar with the PIP, the mesh, the spinal rods, and of course, metal on metal. The problem here is that actually, even though we're very good at collecting data, it takes time to spot trends, whether they be good or bad outcomes. And that, of course, leads to patient safety issues and outcome issues, and it can be very costly and it can be burden on society, particularly if those devices don't perform as well as anticipated. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned, we have in the UK here a very enviable system of clinical research and clinical follow-up, and then coupled with the fantastic work that gets done on the regulatory side with organisations such as Beyond Compliance and ODEP and the National Joint Registry, the BOA, GIRFT, NICE, MHRA, PROMS. We've got a lot of data analysis, and we're gathering a lot of data analysis there. But whilst data analysis give us the when and what, the physical analysis of physical evidence, the why really, has been perhaps lacking in many ways to have a system whereby an implant can be removed from a patient and then independently assessed. Obviously, with research, there's lots of really good research that happens, but it takes time to get the right protocols set up for research. It takes time to gather all the data and then time again to publish. And then on top of that, we've also got these kind of manufacturers' complaints whereby devices that are sent off to manufacturers, not all manufacturers are set up to receive those devices if particularly they're dirty or they don't have a decontamination certificate with them, or even just trying to sort out the packaging. So unfortunately, the picture on the right-hand side here is one that is very common, that a lot of implants, a lot of devices get thrown in the bin, and we miss an opportunity to learn more from it. And the other interesting fact that we've kind of found out over the last few months is really that patients assume that devices are all completely assessed and sent off for testing. And I think patients themselves are becoming aware that that may not be happening. Next slide, please. Obviously, the MHRA and Cormac alluded to them, they recognise that there is a need for physical analysis, but what's happened is there's been a lot of obstacles in order to try and allow that to happen. Manufacturers themselves as well, they've got a legal responsibility to carry out post-market surveillance. So again, manufacturers have a vested interest to say, well, actually, we need to get these implants back. I think it's really the next logical step in improving and understanding the behavior of implants. And we still see in medical device issues such as mesh, which again, they kind of attract publicity in the wrong way, but also it becomes very difficult to kind of undo where lots of problem products have been implanted into patients. But worldwide, there seems to be this growing awareness of needing to have physical analysis. I know it's certainly been discussed at EFORT, Western Australia. They do a lot of work and have done for many years in terms of getting implants back and analysing them. And in the US as well, this work is starting to happen more. Next one. So what can we learn from explant analysis is, well, actually, we can learn key improvements in surgery. Generally speaking, the MHRA as well seem to feel that failures in devices are largely underreported. So they're changing their yellow card system to involve more med tech to allow potential problem products to be reported. But also, what can we learn from explant analysis? It can help surgeons in their choice of devices, particularly around different patient cohorts. And if there is a problem with a device, then obviously if there's a major failure and possible corrective actions are required, it helps to alert this a lot quicker. But it also helps in terms of distinguishing those sporadic events from general failure. So where perhaps a product may be failing, but in relatively small numbers compared to the number that are implanted every year, then it helps to distinguish those sporadic events. It's faster response than research, which can take a long time, as I've already mentioned. But also, I believe that by having this implant analysis service, we can engage with manufacturers to allow those conversations to be happening between procurement, who have purchased devices, and also the companies who are supplying them. It allows for more transparency and ways of improving. Once you've got an explant that's been analysed as well, it allows more discussions around these MDT meetings, audits, clinical governance. But it's not just about finding those problem products. It's about finding out what works well in terms of the patient cohorts, the instrumentation, the techniques. But it also points to where perhaps closer scrutiny is required for those implants that may have concerns around them. Next slide, please. You've mentioned Keith Tucker already, and he's been incredibly supportive. Obviously, Keith is chairman of ORDEP and Beyond Compliance, and he said, "We have always thought that explant analysis of all retrieved implants, particularly if they're novel, should be undertaken. To date, this has hardly happened," and that he's delighted that the implant analysis service is going to facilitate this essential part of implant monitoring. And there's two things really to pick up here is, if an implant is revised because of trauma or infection, and it's a relatively new device, then by having implant analysis, it allows us to find out how these newer devices are behaving in patients. But also it alludes to the fact that actually the implant analysis service, really, we're just providing the transportation and logistics to allow the devices to be taken from the operating theatre in a dirty way, and then to be made available for, once they've had an independent analysis to be undertaken, to be available for researchers, to be available for manufacturers, so they can do their own due diligence and tests as well. And this second quote on the right-hand side, I won't read it all, but this comes out of Baroness Cumberledge's report, which was on mesh, but and then took the wider view in terms of medical devices, and really it mentions that crucial opportunities are lost if we don't analyze and look at these products. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. North Tees and Hartlepool had a history with metal on metal and had a lot of issues around there. So they really kind of experienced this firsthand, and trying to use all that knowledge and experience, they decided to launch a national service. Obviously, there's excellent experience of labs undertaking research and analysis right across UK and Europe. And just looking back, and I'm sure Professor Skinner will correct me if I'm wrong, but online I found that the London Implant Retrieval Centre really started around about 2007, and Newcastle's probably started around about 2011, looking at the ways to analyse implants. So here we are, 2023, and it's really, again, it's about the NHS Implant Analysis Service providing a method to allow the transportation of a device to be kept rather than put in the bin, and then to be independently analysed and then made available for whoever should require it. We went through a tendering process for hips and knees. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different labs out there, and we anticipated quite a large response to that. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So we then re-tendered and held various meetings and put out a prior information notice and engaged with various labs again. And I think really what's happened is that over the last few months in particular, we've seen a lot more interest in this area. I think it's started to gather some momentum, and certainly MHRA, NICE, National Joint Registry, Clinical Alliance are all saying very positive things about it, and there is that awareness starting to grow. But as I keep coming back to, what this service is about is we're bringing together that kind of transportation and logistics to facilitate the NHS to use medical devices and to get them analysed independently. Next slide, please. MHRA, well, there's lots of different things that they kind of have on their website, but this really is about adverse incidents, and it's not necessarily about just the device itself. So again, I bring it back to, ideally, we'd like to try and get as many devices as possible analysed, because it may be down to surgical instruments, it may be down to other products that are used in conjunction. But certainly, you know, they are increasing their medtech yellow card system. And we've engaged with the MHRA, and they're very, very positive now. And they have mentioned that they're going to put out a statement. I don't know when it will be, but they have mentioned they were going to go away and put out a statement about this kind of independent analysis of devices. And their off-the-cuff comment was, "What's not to like?" And what they really focused in on is manufacturers have a legal responsibility to follow up on devices. Yet the system that we've put into place, we can manage to get a report out within 2 weeks. So it can, usually it's less than 2 days, but we say 2 weeks. And they were surprised at how quick this can all be facilitated, because it really does not delay anything else happening that surgeons would like to happen to that device once it's been analyzed and tested. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly run through the process. Next slide. Really, to try and get the most from this service, we've spoken to lots of different hospitals across the UK, and it's fair to say that there's been different approaches in different hospitals. What I'd suggest really is that, you know, this kind of initial implementation is the easiest way by which we can kind of train the theatre staff, train the staff on the paperwork that's required, explain about the patient consent form, the submission forms, and then also to explain, once they receive a report back, how to interpret some of that data that's on the form, but also what to do next. Because it's all fine to say, well, we've received a report back, but it's to look at the ways and consider the ways that a trust can then use that information that we've supplied. The ownership of this is very much with the trust or the hospital who sent us the device in the first place. So however they would like to use the information afterwards is entirely up to them. Next slide, please. So basically what we do is we set the hospital up, and then they order a kit. Essentially it's a box, it's a like a hazardous biohazardous box, which allows you to put a dirty implant into it. All we ask is that you take the responsibility to get the patient's consent. Our experience in terms of getting patient consent is every patient has consented without any issues. However, we've built into it the kind of full information governance. So if a patient consents and then subsequently decides they wish to withdraw consent, we've facilitated for that as well. Once the gross contamination has been removed, it gets popped inside of the box and then in a bag, and then it's sent by special delivery to the NHS lab. I point out here that there's no insurance on this. We looked at this in some detail, and the difficulty trying to insure an item that is used and would normally be thrown into the bin throws up all sorts of different issues. However, to date, we've had no implants have gone missing or lost at all. So if there is any particular issues around insurance, then we're happy to try and help to oblige that. But there's no insurance on this. And obviously, most insurers would only insure it to the value of the initial implant itself rather than anything else. Next slide, please. The report is fairly detailed. There's photographs immediately as the lab receives it. The devices are decontaminated at the lab. And then it goes through a rather scientific, and I can't even pretend to understand the whole areas of how this is analysed and plotted out, but certainly it gives you an awful lot of information in terms of the wear mapping, the microanalysis of the product, the material analysis, and then looking at the overall wear rates, and then compare that with other joints over a period of time. So it can quite quickly give you an assessment of, has this joint performed as anticipated, or is this something that requires, as I mentioned earlier, closer scrutiny? Next slide, please. What we've done here is we've really tried to keep the reports in a PDF format, so they're very easy to share as a slide, so you can use them during your MDTs or clinical audits. The patient information is all removed, so there is just one point of reference on there when it gets to the lab. And then the report itself, when it's sent back to the surgeon, that's all password protected as well. So yeah, it's a very safe method of making sure that it's confidential and that the patient receives the appropriate information back. Next slide, please. Obviously, there's a cost to everything, but this, as I mentioned, this is an NHS service. So the cost of the service analysis is £186, and the report writing comes to about 178. By the time you add in the packaging and shipping and decontamination, everything, it comes to about £460. We actually explored using outside companies who specialize in material analysis, and they were running into thousands. This is through NHS. It is independent, and any profits that were generated would be added back into patient frontline care. Once an implant has been tested, there are options available. You can either store, return, or send it back to the manufacturers. And then there are ways that you can kind of offset some of those costs, particularly if you look at the cost of revisions and loan charges and carriage and everything else, then it's been fed back to us that it's a reasonable charge, but actually we're looking to bring that down even further. Next slide, please. So it offers benefits to patients, surgeons, hospital manufacturers, and researchers. Because these implants no longer end up in the bin, they can be researched further. There are some indirect benefits, and I do apologize every time I say this, but in terms of litigation, the NHS spends an inordinate amount of money on defence. Orthopaedics ranks pretty high up there, and unfortunately, we see TV programs all the time offering no win, no fee. So by having an implant available, at least it provides another option potentially. But also there is this kind of, if you throw an implant straight into the bin, then it can end up as clinical waste. So there's the environment to consider, whereas our plan is to hang on to them if necessary for 7 years, and then they would be disposed in a carbon neutral way to satisfy the NHS requirements. However, it may be that a trust wants us to send them back to them, or for research, or to the manufacturers to have them to have a look at it. Next slide, please. So really, just wrapping up here, it's interesting to see how many people weren't aware of this. We're a relatively small team. We're trying to with a new service, and as I'm sure you can appreciate, it takes time to filter through. But we're obviously talking to everybody that will listen to us. So again, I thank you for allowing us to present today. But we've had a little bit of news in terms of, we've been in some of the clinical journals. We've been on local BBC radio, and there was a small article in the Mail on Sunday, and we're due to have an article in the Orthopaedic Product News. We will be attending BOA this year, so there will be a specific stand there, so I'd encourage you to come along and talk to us there. But all I'd like to say is thank you very much, and to hand back to Cormac.
Jason, that's excellent. I see a few questions coming through already, which we'll hold for the moment. Just one quick one. So the Northeast won the tender for this service. What criteria did they use to select them as the NHS centre? And what happens with the other 3 or 4 centres around the UK?
Yeah, so the initial tender went through an NHS tendering process, so it was advertised in OJEC. When we didn't get such a good response for that, like I say, we then re-tendered again by engaging with all of the different sites that we could. I believe we had a conversation with Harry Horthy, London Implant Retrieval. We spoke to Leeds. We spoke to Tom Joyce up in Newcastle, and then we opened that up again, put out a prior information notice. We had quite a few inquiries from different companies. I mentioned outside companies. By outside of companies, I mean outside of orthopedics. So they came through to us as well. But no, we're kind of looking at that again to see how do we increase the number of different centres that can come forward and tender for this, because I think it's a real opportunity here.
I absolutely agree, and there is, let's be honest, there is relatively few centres
Yeah.
that do a major amount of revision surgery, and they have to be your target. Interestingly, most of those centers are members of the National Orthopaedic Alliance. So that's good, and I hope everybody's listening, because I think we should spread the word. So I don't think you need to convince me, Jason. I think it's the way forward. But there's two things I just wanted to say. Was one, yes, it's about failure, but sometimes you have revision at 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's not what about went wrong. It's about what about how come this implant has survived 20 years and still looks good. Maybe there's a bit of wear, and that's why you're revising it. So sometimes it is, I think it's important to look at why this has went well, which would be a long-term follow-up. So I'm going to stop there. I think, Fallon, you maybe just leave all your pictures up, and we go straight to John. No introduction, John, but maybe you just give us a little bit of background around Stanmore and your interest over the years in implant analysis. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So my interest has worked. I'm a hip and knee replacement surgeon. I do a lot of revision surgery, and the RNOH is a big revision centre. And our interest in implant retrievals and looking at them started really 2003, 2004, which is when we'd started to see hip resurfacings. And we and others made a clinical observation that some of them were just more painful than others. And David Beveland in Northern Ireland in Belfast, his team, following up his patients with the ASR device, found that they were just more painful. His nurse specialist said there's just something different about them, but no one knew why at the time. And so with Alistair Hart, we got involved in looking at them and started collecting implants really from 2007, I think it was. We've collected 10,000 spine, hip and knee implants over the years from 29 countries. And Jason said that the implant industry in orthopedics is big. It really is. There's over 300,000 patients receive an orthopedic implant a year, and the cost of that is £2.5 billion. So it's a lot of implants are going in, and obviously nothing lasts forever. And we know that traditionally orthopedic implants tend to fail either by wear or by failure of fixation over time. Those are the common ones. We know that when we look at implants, there are patient factors, implant factors, and surgeon factors that contribute to any failure. And we need to know what's the dominant driver in each one. And I think that treating everything as failure, as something's gone wrong. We are in a world where if something went wrong or something happened, somebody must be to blame. And that's not helpful. I don't think any of us would buy a washing machine and expect it to be immortal. We know it's going to need replacing at some stage. And that's true with implants. It's bearings for joints are just the same. We've got, what is just amazing is how good the results are. From the National Joint Registry, at 10 years, the revision rate of total knee replacement is 3.5%. That's pretty impressive. Slightly more for posterior stabilized implants than cruciate retaining, but it's similar to that, and that's fairly constant. 95% of hip replacements will last 15 years. Again, that's pretty impressive than what we've got. And I think that retrieval is interesting. It's hard to overstate the importance of implant retrieval analysis when developing successful orthopedic devices. The musculoskeletal system is enormously complex, and no amount of preclinical testing, joint simulation, or analytic modeling can fully predict the performance of implants in human beings in clinical orthopedic practice. And despite the most sophisticated methodologies being applied that were available in the 1990s, when newer alternate bearings were being looked for. Remember, at that stage, the polyethylene was wearing out, and that was causing debris, and that was causing joint replacement failure. So people were looking at new bearing materials. So when they were being developed for hip replacement, there was insufficient information to predict, among other things, no one predicted squeaking with ceramic bearings. And no one predicted adverse local tissue reactions with metal on metal bearings. Cobalt chrome has been used in humans since the 1920s. And it's got an ISO standard. The problem just comes when you articulate it against itself in some people, and it generates the debris, and it's the ionic particles that cause problems. And that wasn't predicted. And that mattered and caused problems. So we focused on that and were able to make a lot of contributions to that. And I think one thing it would be important to say was that the UK led the world in this, that Birmingham hip resurfacing was the first device to come in, that David Langton and Tony Nagel's service in the Northeast and ours in London made the observations. It identified the problem. It was identified in Australia, but nothing really happened about it. We identified the problem between us, worked out what the pathology was, worked out what the solution was, and contributed the evidence that led to guidelines on how to manage these patients. Remember, at the beginning, the fear was the ionic particles were going to cause cancer. And at one stage, it was not beyond belief that every single metal bearing was going to have to be revised in a short time. And that, again, by collecting evidence, was proved not to be the case and not to be important. I think the future, we need to learn from what's happened in the past. And the UK has become a very safe environment in which to innovate and to deliver new products. We've got the National Joint Registry since 2003, and it is the largest registry in the world, the most complete. It covers all ages and pretty much all devices. And if you're going to have a registry, it must be complete. So that's the first thing. With Keith Tucker's ODEP project, we've got the benchmark. We know what is expected of joint replacements. We know what the standards are. We know how long they should last. And myself and Peter Kay and Alistair Hart wrote an article in the BMJ early on in the metal, really just outlining why beyond compliance was going to be a good thing. If you've going to put in a Charnley hip or an Exeter hip, it probably doesn't need much follow-up. We know what the results are. We know it's going to work well. But if you've just invented a new implant, these implants need closer surveillance. And we've got that in the UK through the Beyond Compliance programme. We can now do randomized control studies embedded within the National Joint Register. And so all of that is an important and a safe place for the UK to innovate and develop implants. Well, I don't think any of us can say we've solved joint replacement in every joint, and we should pull up the drawbridge now and just use what we've got. I think what we're all looking for is a joint replacement that lasts 50 years and beyond. We may have it, we just haven't followed them for long enough, we don't know, but that's what we've got to look for. And Jason also mentioned the importance of technology and new technologies to put things in. We know that implants are changing, that they were traditionally made from cast and wrought metals, and now they're often made from additive manufacture. So these materials are constructed, and they're very well used widely in revision surgery. And 15% of revision implants are now made by additive manufacture, and the results seem to be good, but we haven't been following them for all that long. They seem to be very good. There are some differences with them. They can have voids within them. It's this important. They can entrap usually titanium powders inside them. Is that important? So that needs to be followed up. And I think the importance of retrieval analysis is you must have the clinical data. And I think that we do need imaging. We've always maintained with all our implants, we've had imaging as well. What did it look like? What are the patient characteristics? What type of host was the patient? And then you can put all of that together, because if you put the best implant in the world, best cup in the world vertically, it may work, but more likely it won't, or it will generate problems, or it will wear quickly. And it's not, I mean, no surgeon goes out of their way to harm patients or to do surgery wrong, but we know surgery is difficult. Patients are variable, and we need to look at ways of standardizing so we understand what's gone wrong. So I think that's an important thing. Then infection is sadly the commonest cause of failure. Do we learn from implants? And it's I don't know the answer to this, but there are some materials that are said to have lower infection rates that produce less favorable circumstances to form biofilm and infection. And ceramic is one of those that's been mentioned, and texture of surface has also been mentioned. So are we looking at that, and should we look at infected implants? I think beyond compliance and new implants, new manufacturers, we probably should be looking at those implants, because if there seems to be nothing wrong, then that in itself can be very reassuring. But if they're failing early, remember the average failure point for metal on metal hip bearings was about 3 years, just over 3 years. That's when they came to revision. 3 years, 3 months was the commonest time. Obviously, some were never right and revised earlier, and some had failure problems much later. But if there is a slight problem or an issue, we've got a system whereby surveillance and follow-up means that if there is a problem, it can be identified early. So that's patient safety. If we've got a limited budget, should we be looking at every single implant? When I talk to Peter Kay, he says, I've just revised a Charnley hip that's been in for 30 years. And if that's the case, do we learn anything from that? Similar with Exeter, we know the results of the Exeter implant, they're very good. Yes, we can look at them, but will we learn very much? And I think there are some things which are more, you'd want to prioritize more. If budget was an issue, I probably wouldn't prioritize looking at Exeter and Charnley stems ahead of other targets. I think that in the world that we live in, hip replacement, we've got highly cross-linked polyethylene, and I think that's essential in hip replacement surgery. If you're going to use a polyethylene bearing, I think it would be wrong to use conventional polyethylene these days because the wear characteristics are so much better. It's being used in the knee. It's not totally clear of the role of highly cross-linked polyethylene in the knee, and it's a harder, more brittle material. So that's something that may need looking at. Dual mobility implants are a rapid area of growth, and the monoblock dual mobility hip sockets probably have low wear characteristics, but the ones surgeons prefer to use are the ones that have a titanium shell that have a cobalt chrome liner. So therefore we've got a mixed metal interface in the humans, and we know that we usually get corrosion with mixed metals in the human environment. And is that going to be an ionic generating situation going forwards? And then the additive manufacture, these new materials, do those need looking at? And then I suppose the other thing is, do we understand implants that are made in new markets, such as China? Do we know how they're made? Do we know what the standards are? Do we know what the components are going to do? So those are some things. So the question is going to be, can this be supported? I think for beyond compliance, for new implants, I think it is really important to analyze the implants. I think we've got to have an extra level of vigilance for these. More established implants, it's difficult. And I think sometimes when you're getting something off the ground, what we don't want to do is to start by boiling the ocean. Is there something we can do and work out how we can make the system work and collect them? The other thing that would occur to me is collaboration between the units. At one stage, when we were involved in discussions with this process early on, we also have boxes for sending samples, and what you've got to do is then to store them in really good condition. So that means they've got to be temperature controlled, they've got to be humidity controlled, you've got to be stored properly so that there's no bits of metal touching each other. And they've got to be stored under lock and key, and so we can do that, and others can as well. So those are the things that I would start. Those are the first points that I would make.
Thank you very much, John. Can I ask a question, John, just about your unit? So let's pretend 2 years ago I went knocking on your door and said, look, I want this implant analyzed. No, I don't have any money. No, it's not part of a research project. is there a facility in Stanmore, for instance, to do one-off analysis or not?
So there is, yes, and we have done that on, but that's a very selected group of implants which surgeons have selected that they either don't understand or suspect there's a problem on. So we can do that. When the tendering process was going on, it wasn't totally clear what the funding mechanism was and what the funding model was, because to do this work does cost money, it's time consuming. And we were always told that it's got cost and there was no funding for it, and that's something that may have changed. It's not clear to me where its funding is coming from, but that would be useful. And then I think it would be helpful to have more centres involved and collaborating and sharing implants.
That's great. And that's the other question about collaboration. So how are the other units going to collaborate? Jason, you might want to join in here. How are the other units going to collaborate with this new NHS service?
Yeah, well, like I say, I mean, it's still kind of relatively early days. I think we're now about 18 or 19 months into the initial tender. So you know, it'll be re-advertised fairly well in the next few months to go through that. I mean, I think, you know, we kind of really need to kind of look at the whole thing again to say, how can we make this you know, a kind of everyone aware and everyone being able to tender and make it a process that encourages more people to be interested. I think it's naturally going to happen. I think we when we first started this, I think there was a certain amount of kind of skepticism about whether we're going to get it off the ground. I mean, certainly, you know, the experience that we had with information governance, patient consent, the insurance that I mentioned, you know, a lot of people sort of said that those hurdles are going to probably prevent this happening. And we kind of went out there and tendered and then started realizing that, you know, there was a lot of things to this. So even though the tender went out quite some time ago, there was some still, you know, crossing of T's and dotting of I's in terms of some of the logistic issues. But yeah, I mean, certainly we'd encourage everyone to tender for this when it comes around. I mean, it's a developing thing, you know. We're at the, you know, even though it's 18 months into it, we're very, very early stages here, and I just encourage those conversations to happen and to have those conversations so that we can help everybody, researchers, manufacturers, to make this work. Currently, there was a discussion about funding. There is no funding on this, so it's not mandated at all. So it's up to individual hospitals as to what they send us. So the numbers are still relatively small, and I think absolutely to Professor Skinner's point is that, you know, in an ideal world, you'd want every implant so you can learn why did a Charnley last for 15 or 20 years in a particular patient, and yet we see newer implants don't do so well. And so actually we've got to be careful to focus on what can the NHS afford to pay for the devices that they're going to learn the most from and have the most benefit from. But ultimately, you know, if we can...
Can I just interfere, because we're running out of time here. So you're up and running for 18 months. How many implants have been analysed, and where have they come from, and has the money been there to do it?
So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head because I don't get the actual reports. I had asked for it this morning and before I started this, but I would say we've probably had around about 10 hospitals to date have sent us implants, and they have taken that money from their own budget in order to pay for that to happen. Okay. So they've used existing money. As I mentioned earlier, during revision surgery, you know, there's a lot of costs in there in any case. So I think it's really where surgeons have been particularly concerned about a device that they've revised, that they've said, look, you know, it's worth us spending the money to look at this, rather than it being a kind of routine.
Thank you. So I'm just going to move on to a few questions. Number one, why should individual hospitals fund this service? Why not the National Joint Registry or NHS England?
Yeah,
it's the funding bit, because as you know,
yeah,
it's hard to get anything out of the NHS at the moment. It might end up as like the Birmingham Council. It might go bankrupt in the very near future, but that's another story. So funding, yeah. What's with the funding thing? What's your thoughts, Jason?
So I mentioned about North Tees and Hartlepool. So there's the chief operating officer there is somebody called Rowena Dean. So she funds, she basically thinks that this is important enough to put the money, set aside the money in order to have these implants analyzed, probably based on the fact that, they had so many metal on metal problems in the past. I think the individual choice to send an implant is absolutely up to the hospital, whether they want to send it or not. So it's not mandated. It's just up to them whether they want to send it or not.
Well, maybe it should be mandated, because it's like when the National Joint Registry started and other registries, which was voluntary.
Yeah.
Never quite worked on it was mandated, and there was money attached to that mandate, if you know what I mean. If it didn't happen, then you lost cash. So I think that's something to be looked at. Okay, go on to the second question. Surely we need guidance on what to do with the report when it's received. Like, I think you made a comment, Jason, that it's up to the hospital and the individual surgeons to do what they want with the report. Well, that's a tricky one on several grounds, including medical legal grounds. So we need some guidance there. Is that being looked at?
Yeah, so I mentioned that in terms of, if, let's say, an implant comes to us and the surgeon receives a report back, what he may already be deciding that he wants to send the report or the device back to the manufacturer to allow them to access it. It may be that they want to send it to a research facility because they're enrolled in a study. It may be that they would like to retrieve it back for litigation or anything else. It's really, we're facilitating the device to have the independent report back. However, what I will say is come back to one of the other slides that I showed, was one of the important things of these is to actually consider what you're going to do when you do get that report back. Because I think my personal view is that if you receive a report back on a device and there are some concerns, then I'd certainly be raising that concern with the manufacturer and giving the manufacturer access to the device to allow them to conduct their own studies. And then from there, I'd be opening up that conversation and dialogue to get to an endpoint.
I think that's important, because I think, the NJR, I know that would be very interested, and Keith Tucker would be very interested in the results of all of this. But not having a format for dealing with these reports, I think maybe a weakness of the whole system, and I think it probably should be looked at. Because you cannot leave it up to the individual surgeon, I don't think. I think that's very unfair, puts them in a very vulnerable position. Okay, we'll move on. Is patient consent needed? And is a report shared with patient? What's your advice on that one?
Yeah, so there is a patient consent form that is sent out with the box. So the trust who are sending the device to us, it is their responsibility to get the patient consent. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
And is a report shared with the patient? What's been happening in your 10 cases?
Generally speaking, once a report is sent back to a trust, we wouldn't know if that's been shared with the patient or not. We've left that up to the individual surgeon as to what they feel would be appropriate to their practice and to the patient.
I know. I think that's what I see is a problem, what to do with the report, and saying the default response being it's up to the individual surgeon, because the hospital will be paying for it. So it may be up to the individual hospital.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Then you've got other issues with possible litigation, complaints from patients. Why did my implant fail? So it gets really sticky. So, and it has to be combined, obviously, as hinted. Failure is multifactorial. It's not always about the implant, but actually having a report that's normal, saying this implant is well fixed, blah, blah, blah. I think that might be useful in itself. Yeah. Final question, Jason. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just about to say, so as I mentioned a few times, it's still very much in its infancy in terms of the process. And
Okay.
I think the points that you've raised there are absolutely critical, because it's fine to receive a report back, and I'd probably go a step further. You receive a report back which gives you information you may not be familiar with. So I think it's the whole thing. I think it's a whole service whereby you receive a report back, you're aware of what options are available, you know how to interpret that information that's being given to you, and then also to spell out what potentially you could do with that information. I mean, we wouldn't be able to kind of offer. I don't believe we could offer an edict as to you must do this when it's a choice. I think if the service is mandated, then it certainly changed the whole parameters of what you can ask the surgeon to do once he receives his report back. But I mean, if you look at the National Joint Registry, it took a long time to get compliance on that. Certainly, it didn't happen within the first few months. But I think all of these things, they need to be discussed. And that's why it's really good to have these sort of discussions so that we can help to shape this going forward. And again, I'd reiterate to all the other centres, particularly with Professor Skinner, is to have these conversations and help to develop a way of what to do with the information that comes through.
Okay, good. And finally, it's so easy to blame an implant for failure. All early failures should be investigated. Should this be mandated? That's a question really for John. What do you think about that? All early failures, you must report your investigations. Maybe it will include an implant analysis. It might also include some analysis of technique, the surgeon himself, blah, blah, blah. But where are we with that, with early failure? What happens with early failure? I know if you see a trend on the National Joint Registry, you make a phone call. But before then, is there any mandation for early failure for it to be discussed, for instance, at MDT or whatever?
So, I mean, it's a really good question, because what we know from registry data is that early failures, when they're revised, do worse than implants that are revised years down the line. And that's because the mode of failure is different. So if you've had a joint replacement in for 10, 12, 15 years and it's worn and you've got benign debris disease response to it and it's loosened, revisions of those do incredibly well. So aseptic loosening knee replacement revisions do incredibly well. If early failure tends to be different, so in hip replacement, early failure is dislocation, infection, or periprosthetic fracture usually. And those are the groups which have got a more difficult and worse outcome going on. You want to know if it is an implant failure, certainly. So can it be mandated? The NJR only became complete and inclusive when it was mandated, when best practice tariff mandated that you put recorded your patient in the National Joint Registry. We know from all the other, the smaller registries, that what they're crying out is for mandation, because otherwise you've got a registry that's incomplete, that's got a small percentage of all implants, then they're very difficult to interpret and may not be widely applicable. So that's the question. And the thing is, if it comes back then with no problem with the implant, patient implant surgeon factors, does that become de facto evidence that the operation's been performed badly, and does it get sent to the patient with a duty of candor letter? So there are things we don't understand. I think that the answer is that the profession and the regulators need to get together and to work out what we're looking for. What problem are we trying to solve? What's the best way of doing it? What is the minimum level of analysis we would expect of an implant? Is that standardized? Who's going to fund it? And do we look at everything? Do we look at early failures? Early failures is catastrophic for patients and probably less understood than the others, but may not always be an implant issue, may have a technique issue. So I think that would be the way forward. And with Jason, I'm sure we could put together a group to discuss this, because I think it has got to be bottomed out. And the NOA has really been a big help in drawing this forward, because implant retrieval analysis has been very helpful, is almost certainly essential to the future, but we've got to work out how we fund it and how broadly we apply it early on, and how we develop it.
Well, look, But we'd be delighted to do that and to organise to meet and talk about this, because I think it, if nothing else, when we have meetings like this, it provides a platform to raise the importance of all the points that you've made there.
Jason, are you at the BOA this year? Next year?
Yes, I will be at the BOA. So and actually we have a stand there, so there is a stand. But
are you aware of the ODEP prethesion on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock?
Okay.
You are okay, but that's important. So there is there's a group within the BOA. I think, I'm not quite sure what the group. Actually, I'll have it on the next slide here. But look, I'm going to take the opportunity of thanking both of you for joining us and sharing all of that. I think we'll hear more about this, and I think it's really important. Fallon, can you pop up the poll there while I share my screen, if that's okay? So there it is. I'm convinced the NHS implant analysis is the way forward. Yes, no, not sure. I will be pursuing further information on the service. Yes, no, not sure. Could we have the results there, Fallon, please? So that's pretty positive, and I think that's the way it should go. That we should find out more, and we should chase this down, ask some more questions. So that's really encouraging, and thanks for that. So just to say, yeah, there it is there. The Explant Alliance, it's called, guys. Thursday, 9 o'clock, room 13. Led by Keith Tucker. It really is important that you're there, Jason, and your clinical team as well.
Yeah.
Just to advertise, 19th October is the National Orthopaedic Alliance. I was going to say Booze Up, National Orthopaedic Alliance annual meeting with our Excellence in Orthopaedic Awards. I hope everybody can make it. Stay up to date on the website, and the more people join us, the better. And at that, I just leave it to thank the speakers and everybody in the background within the NOA for organizing this webinar. I think it's been very useful. It is recorded, and please share it, Jason. Please take it and share it with your colleagues, because I think there was very useful discussion there.
Will do. Thank you.
I'm going to wish you all a good day, and I'm going to sign off. So thanks everybody for joining. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.